Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Stella Lawrence, and I'm a proud board member of the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, and I'm also a former reporter at the Woonsocket Call in Northern Rhode Island. I'm thrilled tonight to be joined by our two esteemed speakers, Susan Goldberg, President and CEO of GBH, and Margaret Lowe, CEO of WBUR. Thank you both so much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Before we get started, a reminder that we'll try to leave some time for audience questions at the end, but please feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go, and we might be able to get to them sooner. And we'll get started. So you each came to public media at different points in your careers. Margaret, I know you spent decades at NPR in various roles, including the top editorial job, before joining the Atlantic's events division, and then finally WBUR in 2020. And Susan, you joined GBH in 2022 after a wide-ranging career at nationally recognized outlets such as National Geographic and Bloomberg News. If you recall, what drew you each to public media?
You want to start, Susan, or you want me to go?
I think you should go because you started early in your career and I started late in my career.
I mean, I will take you way back. First of all, thank you for having me. And I see a lot of old friends and new in the audience. So it's wonderful to be here. I thought I wanted to be a documentary producer. And just out of college, I had my first job and I met a woman who was producing oral histories and was producing an oral history for this place called National Public Radio. And I ended up working for her and producing a half-an-hour documentary about the history of labor in New York City and the birth of the Congress of Industrial Organizations. This is 1981. So I'm dating myself, and such is life. And I fell in love with audio and had just had a thing for storytelling and found my way very shortly thereafter as an overnight production assistant on Morning Edition, where I got up at midnight and went to work at 1 a.m, and the rest is sort of history.
All right, let's see. My answer is very different. I started out as a newspaper reporter, spent most of my career, well, almost all of my career really, in commercial media. I kind of made my way up through newspapers, ended up being the editor of several large newspapers, worked at Bloomberg, as you mentioned, USA Today. I was the editor-in-chief and editorial director of National Geographic for 8 years. And I had sort of reached the point where I thought, how much I loved my work and didn't quite know what to do next. And then one day the phone rang and it was GBH saying, would I be interested in talking to them about being the CEO? And I thought, you have definitely called the wrong person, because I never worked in radio, I'd never worked in television, and I'd never worked in public media. But they said, no, they actually had called the person that they wanted to talk to. And what I was so drawn to was, I mean, what we do at GBH was sort of like a combination of all of the parts of my job that I thought were the most meaningful and that made a difference to audiences, right? Local news, big national and international stories, an opportunity to reinvent on digital platforms. And so I thought, okay, this is it. And plus I'd never lived in the Northeast before, and I thought I would see what that was like too. And it's been a really great move.
I'm glad to hear you've been enjoying the Northeast. I know it can be a culture shock to some. I'm actually back home in my native California right now, so but I am normally in Boston as well. So it's very interesting to hear about the ways that you came to public media, and I know we could spend an entire kind of talk like this nitpicking the answers and kind of pulling apart your careers, how you got here, but this is about the Rescissions Act of 2025, and so we can turn now to that. I also see that we've had some people join in the last couple minutes, and so I just want to remind everyone that you can throw your questions for our speakers in the chat, and I will try to screen those as we go through. So, turning now to the Rescissions Act of 2025, that became law in late July, but the writing, I would say, was actually on the wall back in May with President Trump's Executive Order 14290 titled Ending Taxpayer Subsidization of Biased Media. So when did you begin to seriously address threats to public media funding, and what were some of the first steps that you took at that point?
I mean, I took it seriously from the beginning, from even before that, right? Because after President Trump was elected, I thought that there would be a challenge, of course, to the funding again, because, well, if nothing else, every Republican administration, I think for the last 50 years, had attempted or had talked about defunding public media. But it felt like we were really living in a different time. So we started very early on talking about different scenarios of what could happen under defunding. You know, we also, and I know Margaret did too, spent some time in Congress, right, talking with delegation members and others about the importance of public media. But at GBH, I can tell you that we had scenarios, worst case scenarios, we had semi-bad scenarios where there was like partial defunding, and then we had delayed scenarios where they didn't actually claw back the 2 years of money that Congress had already appropriated for 26 and 27, but just decided to defund beginning in 28. So we looked at all of that, and what we ended up with, unfortunately, was the very worst case scenario, which was the entire clawback of $1.1 billion that had already been appropriated. And that takes effect in 40 days, 40 days from now. So that's where we are. But we were making plans and talking about scenarios very, very early on.
Yeah, and you know, the interesting thing is that, as Susan said, there have been decades and decades where Congress has been trying to claw back funding for public radio. And sort of my earliest introduction to it, obviously it had happened even before then, but was in 1995. And I was a producer on All Things Considered, and Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House, and he tried very hard to defund public radio. And at the time, there was really, it was serious, but there was just much more bipartisan support for public media, and much more willingness from in red states and blue to really stand by the need for public media. And it was clear in this administration that it was a much more serious threat. And so we've been both bracing for it and preparing for it, you know, since November, really. And I think the important thing for people to know, I mean, obviously we would have been naive to think that it wouldn't happen. And yet I would say that we all played a really good ground game. You know, we were, as Susan said, we were up on the Hill. We were talking to members of Congress. Obviously, from Massachusetts, we have a totally blue delegation. They're all incredibly supportive of public media, and I think in particular Senator Markey really rallied to our defense. I know the day the executive order came down, he called both me and Susan personally to say he was going to fight for us, that he really felt like there was a chance for us to prevail. And, you know, we didn't lose by that much. I mean, it was just a couple of votes, and you know, had everybody been there the first time in the House, we could have prevailed. That said, I think even if we had won both the Senate and the House in this last round, that there would have been other ways, that the other attempts and other methods to try to come after public media. And I think, I mean, the truth is that if we didn't matter, they wouldn't want us gone. If we didn't matter in the lives of millions and millions of Americans. And, you know, this isn't the only threat, and there's not too much to say, except that the FCC is actually still coming after us in meaningful ways as well, challenging the way that we, challenging our on-air sponsorships, and suggesting that they're commercial sponsorships, and therefore we shouldn't be on the left-hand side of the dial. So the threats are coming from multiple directions, and that's still there, even though defunding happened. And I know Dan Kennedy is in the audience, and Dan, that's not something that I want expressed publicly, but I think for a bunch of journalists, you should understand all the different threats that we're facing.
Absolutely. You both alluded to the fact that the vote in the House was very close, 216 to 213, as I have it, and that you did some lobbying on the Hill. We'll get into public perception a little bit more later, but I'm curious how your pitch to Congress differed, if at all, from your pitch to sort of the general public.
Oh, I mean, I don't think it differed at all. What I think we need to do is remind people of the difference that we make in people's lives, whether that is, helping parents educate their kids or providing trusted news content or inspirational programming. And I think the key word there is trust and really the work that we do in our communities. We've got a really proud history at GBH. Our GBH and WBUR are about the same age, really. I think BUR is about a year older or something like that. So we've both been around for basically 75 years doing really important work. And so I found that our delegation, as Margaret said, was incredibly supportive. And that was never going to be the problem. The issue was, would some of our, Congress people and senators be able to convince some of their colleagues across the aisle that for the price of $1.60 per American per year, this is a worthwhile investment. And unfortunately, they weren't able to.
So as you both mentioned before, this act eliminates or claws back almost 1.1 billion in funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is the funding mechanism for NPR and PBS and member stations like GBH and WBUR. So in a real sense, what sorts of line items will be on the chopping block in the next 2 fiscal years?
Do you mean in our individual organizations?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, I think more broadly, it's important to know that the threat across the country is profound, and that there are dozens and dozens of stations, both television stations and public radio stations, that could have to turn out the lights. And of course, many of those stations are in more rural areas and places that often don't have any other news. And so they just become these terrible news deserts. I think both Susan and I can say that, and I don't mean to speak for you, Susan, but GBH and BUR will be here, but we just may have to make some hard decisions. And I think it's also important, and Susan can explain the impact on television better than I can, but television and radio are affected differently because the funding was broken up 75% for television and 25% for radio. And we're both sort of dealing with the impact on our stations. We get about $1.6 million from the CPB every year. We collected it in 2025. That's about 3% of our budget. So it's serious. It's not insurmountable. The thing that you add to that, the fact that many of our programs are syndicated across the country. We produce On Point and Here and Now, 3 hours of national programming a week, and those are paid for by stations across the country. And if stations don't have the ability to pay, the impact on our syndication dollars, which supports the whole newsroom, could be affected. And it's actually really, really hard to tell right now how serious that impact will be.
Yeah, I agree. It is going to take a while for this impact to work its way through the system, both on the radio side and the TV side. So we're a joint licensee. We're a dual licensee, right? We've got radio and TV. So we're a little bit different from WBUR. But on both sides of this house, it's going to take a while for us to see completely. There are a lot of efforts underway to help stabilize the system. There's big donor efforts going on to specifically reach out to some of the smallest and most vulnerable stations who had the highest percentage of their budget paid for by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And then there are efforts by NPR and PBS to try to help them as well. PBS had an across-the-board dues decrease of 21%. You know, smaller stations got more, bigger stations somewhat less, but it averaged 21%. That is a substantial amount of money, and I think it will be very helpful. But nonetheless, the system is all interconnected. And so when you pull away that federal funding, and if certain stations start to fall or can't pay their dues, it will affect us at GBH. You know, just as Margaret said, it could affect WBUR as well. So we're the largest creator of programming for PBS, in addition to the work that we do locally. And then we've got a big education arm as well. And we're in partnership with PBS on these efforts that are used literally by millions of teachers across America's classrooms. So all of this becomes sort of, I don't want to say on the chopping block, but certainly how we're gonna need to deal with this. We're gonna have to make some hard decisions as well.
Mm-hmm. You've both kind of alluded to my next question, which is, you know, these more vulnerable stations, particularly in rural or tribal areas, are, you know, the most vulnerable to some of these cuts. And it sounds like there's maybe been some coordination between affiliate stations across the country, or maybe at a national level. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about any other potential lifelines for these more vulnerable stations, especially maybe for people who are supportive in places that are a little bit more lucky, like Boston, which is, as you said, a more robust news ecosystem.
Susan referred, so I think, Susan, you sort of made mention of this, but yesterday, several major foundations, from the Knight Foundation to the MacArthur Foundation, announced a $37 million effectively lifeline to exactly the stations that we're talking about here. And and the dispensation of those dollars are being managed by what's called the Public Media Bridge Fund. I think that's right, which is part of Public Media Company. So there's a tremendous amount of attention being paid, and it's obviously a bridge fund, which is not necessarily lasting forever, but there was a sense that there was an immediate and urgent need to cauterize the wound. And I would also say, I mean, what's heartening is that it's clear people actually really value what we do. And so fundraising has been really breathtaking in lots of parts of the country. And so it's very heartening to see how people have really rallied. And I know Susan and I are going to both count on that over the next months and years. And it's not, you know, we know that it's not a one-time fix. It's not like give now and we'll be fine. It's like we're going to have to make sure that people who give more, and people who haven't given really jump in with us and help support something that they value.
You know, I would add, and I agree with all of that. The only thing I would add is, well, I do think it's a great effort to help some of these smaller stations, because there really is, as Margaret said, in many of these places, there really is no other source of news. And the last thing we need in our country is more news deserts, right? Pushing down civic engagement and people's ability to make informed decisions. That's the opposite of what we need. But I would hate for the money that people are, you know, so generously giving to some of these smaller stations be at the expense of some of the larger stations that create the content that is used, in fact, all over the country. And I think also the larger stations have an ability to help stabilize the system and work collectively with people. You know, it's sort of like how we work with two of our stations, WCAI and NEPM in Western Massachusetts, right? We do some of the back end or behind the scenes kind of work with NEPM. So they're doing the reporting, you know, in the communities and the fundraising in the communities, but we're handling most of the HR functions, for example, and many of the, you know, finance kinds of functions. So are there collectives in ways that would make sense all over the country, not just in Massachusetts, not just in New England, but really all over the country, where there can be a new way of looking at what a public media system could function like so it can be most efficient.
Hmm. And are you starting to have those kinds of conversations now, or those have been ongoing?
Oh, I think that these conversations have been held in fits and starts across the public media system for any number of years. And Margaret, I'm sure, can speak to it better than me. But I would say that given what has happened with defunding, there is an urgency about these conversations, and I think a seriousness that we could see some different results.
Got it. So you've set us up nicely, kind of for my next portion here, which is I want to zoom out a little bit from kind of the immediate urgency of the defunding to kind of a more philosophical maybe discussion about the role of local news and public media in our country, in our communities. Trump's May executive order asserted that neither NPR nor PBS, quote, presents a fair, accurate, or unbiased portrayal of current events to tax-paying citizens. And I'm wondering how important you think it is for consumers of local news and public media to understand how reporters, producers, editors think about those kinds of journalistic concepts like fairness and accuracy.
I mean, I think it's crucial. I think the more we can do to peel back the curtain on how we do our work and how we gather our stories is really important, because one of the things that the one thing we can't lose is the trust of the audience. And and the other thing we have to make sure of is that what we're doing is appealing to more people in more places and more ways, so they find us and discover us. But I think, I think Susan would agree with me, there is we have multiple jobs to do. One is to report everything that's unfolding in our world today to the greatest degree that we can. And I think what is distinct about public radio is that it is we're not just covering the news, we're actually building a sense of connection and community, and we sort of tether people to each other. There's something very powerful about the human voice that cuts through the noise and reminds us of our shared humanity. Stories are sort of fuel for life, and there are more things I think that people have in common than that they don't. And so I think we need to lean into the role that we play as civic institutions in our community. I mean, I often say that some people spend more time with WBUR, and surely true of GBH, than the people that they love most in the world. Like, we are really important in people's lives. And I think that that's different in kind than other forms of media, right? It is different than the text in a newspaper, and it is different than, a social feed on your iPhone. People spend real deep time with us, and I like to believe that part of our job is building community, and in some ways making our communities stronger and making the world that we live in a better place.
The only thing I would add is, look, there's multiple ways to reach people, and we have to reach them wherever. My belief is whatever platform we started on, and I thought this in newspapers too. So whether it was ink on dead trees, or whether it is terrestrial radio or linear television, whatever legacy platform we started on, we've got a huge opportunity right now and a real obligation to reach people how they want to be reached, whether that's on YouTube or on TikTok or, on through podcasts or whatever it might be. But the thread that binds all of this together is being that trusted source of news and information. And I think what Margaret said about transparency is exactly right. I'm incredibly proud of the work that we do on programs like Frontline, where there's something called the Transparency Project. We create these investigative documentaries, and people watch them. Millions of people watch them. Millions more watch them on YouTube, even with that long tail. But what people can also do is go onto our YouTube channel and look at the whole interview. So obviously documentaries, like any kind of journalism, is edited down. You don't get to see all the notes, but what you can do with the Transparency Project is look at all the interviews in full. So you could decide for yourself, well, was that a fair representation of what somebody said or wasn't it? And it's astounding how many people seem to have the time to want to watch these interviews at great length. And look, I think it's absolutely great, but I believe it's efforts like that whatever is the platform, we've got to figure out how to help consumers trust us again, because one of the most tragic things going on in our country is the absolute lack of trust in factual information provided by legitimate purveyors of news and information. It's very concerning.
You seem to be reading my mind here a little bit, because I did a little bit of that research, and unsurprisingly, polls as recent as last year still show that people of both bipartisan leanings largely trust their local news and still value that pretty highly, but trust in what most of the polls call mass media divulges significantly between Republicans and Democrats, self-identifying. And I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on the role that you see local and public media playing in closing some of those partisan gaps.
Oh, I think the best way to rebuild trust is from the local level up. I really absolutely do. And having come out of local newspapers, I mean, it's pretty remarkable because you get to know people in the community that you cover. I mean, I've been yelled at in the grocery store across the tomatoes, and once when I was in Cleveland, I was the editor of the Plain Dealer, and I was at a gym in the morning. It was quite early. It might have been like 5:30 or 6 in the morning, and I'm doing sit-ups on the floor, and some guy came and started, hovering over me and yelling at me while I was on the ground. And he was yelling at about a story that was on the front page of the Plain Dealer that morning. And I'm not suggesting that that's great behavior, but what's good about it is that people feel like they know who they can complain to, and they know where a story is coming from. And they often might know the reporter, and they know people in the community, and you can have a real conversation. It's pretty tough at, a large national level. And I've been there too, at National Geographic or Bloomberg or USA Today. People don't even know where to call or what to do. And so there's an expression I kind of like. It's hard to hate up close. It's really true. I mean, when you know people and when you know who to talk to, it is a lot easier to trust that person. It doesn't mean you're going to like what they did, but you might not hate them, and you might not otherize them, and you might not make them the enemy. And that's sort of where we are in our country right now.
I had not heard that. It's hard to hate up close. That's great. It's interesting. I spent the bulk of my adult life in national news organizations, and there's something in us, and I've been at WBUR for more than 5.5 years, and there's something that feels very personal about reporting on your own community. And I think Susan's right. I mean, people they feel like they have a one-to-one relationship with you. And one of the things that I find is that people write really passionate letters, and I always, and sometimes they're really, really mad at us. And I always think those are the people we need to keep, because they care enough to take the time to write you the letter or come and drop off a letter at the front desk. And they're invested because you're theirs, right? They have a relationship with you. And so I think you do build trust. And I think, we're in their towns, we're shopping at the same grocery stores. I've not had anybody yell at me over the tomatoes, but it is a very, very personal feeling, and a very different relationship than with national news organizations. And I think it's going to be harder for national news organizations to climb back, and the whole, those who were supportive of public media in general, on the Hill, really talked about the value of local. And how local tethers people together, how local, if you have a rich local news organization, that people feel connected to their community, they vote, they have a more civic engagement. I mean, it's part of the underpinning of a healthy city, country, democracy. And the minute you get lofty, it loses meaning, but it really does tether people together.
I can say I really resonate that as a former local news reporter. I was also not yelled at over the tomatoes, but I definitely did get my fair share of, emails and nastygrams and whatnot. But you're right that it really shows that people are closely reading what you're putting out there, and that they care enough to write back. I'm interested. So I've heard you kind of talk about this transparency element and local media's ability and public media's ability to kind of do that a little bit more frequently, maybe because those are the faces of the community. You're seeing your audience kind of out and about on the day to day. I also know that that was sort of a trend towards maybe a way that journalism writ large would have to kind of adapt and survive in this more untrusting era, perhaps. And I'm wondering if we can maybe draw the line with those efforts and these funding cuts. Do you think that these cuts are going to hamper those kinds of efforts to adapt and transform, or do you think that they might force some of that adaptation and maybe there might be some silver lining innovation coming out of this?
I actually think that the cuts, well, they will cause many hard choices and perhaps some decisions that nobody wanted to make, will speed up a lot of innovation and a lot of evolution that was already underway. And I don't want to say that's the good part of them, because I don't think any part of it's good. But I do believe that just like COVID speeded up a lot of things in our society that were going to happen anyways, this is true of where we are, because look, we've gonna all of us are transforming our businesses because we need to. And it doesn't matter, as I said before, what legacy platform you started out on. These are all digital businesses in the end, because that is where everything is going. It doesn't mean you stop doing the thing or devalue the thing that made you good in the first place, because there's strong audiences still for all of that content. But we're all becoming digital businesses, and this forces that to happen even more quickly. I do not think that the defunding in any way affects a great news organization's desire or ability to tell the truth, to find correct facts, and to publish them. I don't think it affects it at all.
I totally agree. I mean, the defunding is a forcing mechanism, and it makes us all have to be be smarter about what we do and how we do it and how efficiently we do it. But the first thing, I mean, I think everybody feels like the most important thing to preserve is high quality journalism in whatever form it's taking.
That's certainly heartening to hear, and I will avoid making any AI jokes or asking you about that at all. As we've kind of been discussing, there has been a groundswell of public support in light of these cuts and donations, I believe. And, those of us who grew up watching and listening to public media know the familiar phrase, supported by viewers like you. Maybe you could give us a little more details about how the public has stepped in these times and how much more support you may be seeking in the future.
So you want to start, Susan? It's funny, we just sat around a table today reading all the notes from people who have supported us, not just in the last couple of months since defunding, or it's only been a month, it feels like a year since defunding, but just in the past year in general, and really trying to think about how we tell our story in a different way, because it is a different story. I mean, the crazy part for us is we just had the best year we've ever had. We raised 20% more donor dollars than we'd anticipated, and we actually were gently profitable this year. And sort of just as we see the light, this happens. I think, if you just look at broadcast, which is just a small piece of the puzzle for us, about 15% of the audience gives, which is extraordinary when compared to other media. The number of people who subscribe to other media compared to the people who subscribe to public media is doesn't touch it. And public media understood a long time ago, as you clearly grew up as a public television watching and backseat baby listening to public radio. There are two things that we did right and we're ahead of our times. One, it was understanding that we have a direct relationship with the audience, right? That we are talking to the audience, that they feel a connection to us. And the fact that people give, I mean, everybody in this room has heard this or said this out loud themselves. The fact that people give, even though they don't have to, is astonishing. And they give not just because they like what we do, but they believe in the values of what we do, and they know they're supporting it not just for themselves, but for lots and lots of people. And I think, you know, as we anticipate the year ahead, we think if we could find 10,000 more donors and have everybody who gives 10% more, that would cover it. And so really it's about, you know, you don't want to, you want people to feel invested enough so that they jump into the fray. And we've had these wild examples recently where people have been listening to a fundraiser, and we had a gentleman call us not too long ago. He was listening to the fundraiser, and he called in and he gave $10,000, and our team quickly realized he'd never given before. They found the data that made it clear that he had as we gently like to say, capacity. They called him up and they said, would you like to come in and visit WBUR? And he said, I'd love to. I've been listening for years and years and years, and I've never given. And he sat with one of our major gifts officers and Tiziana Deering, our morning edition host. And he walked out and he'd written a $250,000 check. He said, I just understood for the first time that I could and should do this. And so Susan's team certainly knows, and our team certainly knows, there are lots and lots of people who could give something. And there are lots and lots of people who could give a lot to sustain what we do. And so part of it is figuring out how to tell that different story so people feel motivated to support something that they actually love. And they actually tell us, I can't imagine a day without you. And while we spend a lot of time fundraising, there is something very, very heartening about the fact that people pick up the phone or press the donate button online and give because they believe. It's a pretty stunning act.
You know, these stories and I'm hearing them from colleagues across public media all over the country, right? Whether on the television side or the radio side, or those of us who are joint licensees. I mean, I think pretty much, I don't want to say everybody, but many outlets are having suddenly enormous results from fundraising, and we have as well. It's been quite remarkable. You know, we had a great fundraising year in the last year, and certainly since rescission, there has been a huge bump. And the people who are calling are signing up to be sustainers, right? So they're saying, this isn't just a one-off for me. We're going to be sustained contributors. But all of that said, I don't think that fundraising alone is going to solve what is going to be a structural problem long-term. It is pretty hard across the system to replace $1.1 billion or $535 million each year, which is how much the CPB has given. So I do think that we need to think of other really creative ways, in addition to reaching out to audiences, to helping them understand our value. We've got to be better. We've got to be more clear about what our value proposition really is. But I think we also have the opportunity to try to figure out other ways that we need to raise funds, whether that's on figuring out more commercial opportunities on non-broadcast platforms, on digital platforms, or doing other things that can help us grow revenue. So that is going to be one of the key things as we reinvent our businesses going forward, because this is a substantial hit.
I always say we've been raised with the business model for public media has been the same for years and years and years. It's been member dollars, philanthropy, foundation dollars,
Sponsorship.
federal dollars, and you can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And so, like, I agree with Susan, and one of the things we've been doing is creating what we've called other bets, which are small but startup businesses that are beginning to draw revenue, and we all have to do that, right? We have a custom podcast studio where we're pretty good at producing podcasts, and we now produce them for businesses because everybody in the whole wide world wants to do a podcast but doesn't necessarily have the wherewithal or the capacity to do it. So we've sort of launched this business, which is, it's a sapling, it's not a tree, but it's beginning to pay dividends, and there, a number of other things like that, but we need to be really contemplating other bets and be really entrepreneurial in a way that we haven't necessarily had to be before.
Exactly.
I can say it's heartening to hear you both say that you're, thinking ahead in those ways and kind of branching out a little bit. But I wanted to circle back to something Margaret said, the story you told about the donor who got the chance to tour the studios and meet some of the employees there and the people he had been hearing on the radio. Because it's interesting, we had been talking about the importance of transparency, and it seems like making the process more transparent is a way to both show people the value of the product and also increase their trust in the actual quality of the product itself as well. So it seems like there's kind of room for both sides of the business, like the actual journalism side or product side, and then the sort of financial side of it, to benefit from that more transparent approach. Would you agree with that?
I love the word transparency because of what it stands for, but I also like it literally because it reminds me of what we do at the Boston Public Library, right? GBH has a studio at the Boston Public Library, and it is a literally transparent studio. So people can come in, sit down, get a cup of coffee, and watch us create the content in front of them. Right? They can peer through the windows, or they can come on inside. And we have shows like Ask the Governor, Ask the Mayor, Ask the Attorney General, where regular people can come up to a microphone and actually ask the governor of the state the question. I don't know anywhere else. Maybe it happens somewhere, but I don't know of anywhere else where you can do something like that. And so I think it's that kind of transparency too that can really help us build back trust. But I love all of these efforts and just think we need to take a really methodical approach to our content and figure out, okay, on this platform, how do we help invite people in ways that maybe we were uncomfortable doing before, but we need to do more of? Because as much as I wish we could meet every single person and have them come in and meet everybody, that is not going to be a realistic thing that we can do. So what are some more en masse methods that we can employ to make people feel like, oh, I get it. I know who's reporting that. I get where that's coming from. I understand how they access that information. That's what we've got to do.
And I love that library story, and it's so true, right? I mean, that's a rare experience in a community. And I want to go back to the donor who came in and just talk a little bit about people's relationship that they feel with the people they hear on the air. So they meet Tiziana Deering. I see that Lisa Mullins is here. They meet Lisa Mullins. They meet Bruce Gellerman. They meet people whose voices they know, and the sense of connection is very powerful. And I think sort of pivoting off what Susan described about the library, there's also something very meaningful, I think, in our worlds today, and both GBH and BUR do this, which is we actually bring the community together, whether it's at the library or at City Space or at the BUR Festival. There's something very powerful about bringing people together in a room, in a place, to talk about some of the most pressing issues of the day. And it's different than a one-to-many that broadcasting is, or even a newsletter is. It's actually people feeling like they're part of something bigger than themselves, that they're part of a community. I mean, we launched the BUR Festival in the spring, and it was the first time we did it. Yes, because we're a year older than GBH. We turned 75 this year. GBH turned 75 in 2026, just in time for the 250th. But I literally had people sort of running after me on the street and saying, thank you. We needed this so much. And it was just a sense that they had something that was a rich, deep, connecting experience in their community. And I think there's a real longing for that. And it is a way, sort of back to the question of transparency, it is a way to kind of peel back the curtain and say, we're actually yours. We belong. Like the people, our job is serving the people who live here. And I think people feel that when you open your doors, as Susan and her team do at the library, and as we do too.
Absolutely. I can say that I've had great experiences at both the GBH studio in the library and at WBUR City Space. So
You are a total, like, what we call a core, you're total core, aren't you? It's wonderful.
thank you. I try. So we have about 15 minutes left. We're going to turn it over to our audience questions soon, so everyone can start throwing those in the chat. And I'll admit, I was a little worried that this event might kind of be a bit of a downer, and it's actually been quite inspiring and enlightening. But I'm still going to end on this question, and so you can just drive it home. But as our last kind of note here before we turn it over to questions, what gives you hope these days?
Oh, I mean, what gives me hope is the work that we can do and the difference that we can make in people's lives. I mean, I know this sounds unbelievably corny, but it's why I became a journalist in the first place. It's why after 45 years, I'm still a journalist. Why, even though I'm the CEO, I'm still a journalist. It's why I care about the kinds of stories that we do and care so much about preserving and growing what we do, because I totally believe in that the stories we tell can change the world. And if I didn't believe that, I would have stopped doing this a long time ago. But what gives me hope is the opportunity to reach more audiences than ever, bigger audiences than ever, at one level because of the tools we've got. But then, as Margaret was saying, these in-person events and ways to touch people in a very personal way also give me a lot of hope. Look, we work a lot with kids at GBH. We create a ton of children's content. I mentioned that we were in a business with PBS to create content for teachers to use in the classrooms. When I think about what gives me hope, it's that educational content can help the half of kids in this country who do not get to go to pre-K, right? So it gives them a way to even that playing field. So when they can go into kindergarten, they might know how to read and they might know how to do math. They might have some social skills through content that we create. And that's, I feel it is literally that important. And I feel that way about all of our storytelling, but I think that the kids part of our operation is something that really everybody can relate to and understand.
I'll add, I mean, I sometimes marvel at how animated I feel even in this moment. And I sometimes think, okay, maybe I'm just old and like I know nothing, and I know I'm not going to die, right? Because I mean, the sort of losing federal funding was a real gut punch, and we braced ourselves for it. But I think, like Susan, I believe, I mean, I've devoted my life to this cause, right? It sounds corny, but I really, really have, because I believe so deeply in the power of journalism and storytelling to change lives. And I also love what we make. Like, I really love what we make and all the things we make. And the other thing that animates me is that even in this really kind of rocky time for the country and the world, we have an amazingly talented and creative and ambitious staff. And And that hasn't waned at all. And they're still making great things and coming up with big ideas. And it just makes, I mean, at the end of the day, there's actually a lot of fun in the work we do. So and I'm either have the good fortune or to be an optimist. And I think for me anyway, and I think for us, it's a force multiplier.
Excellent. We've got a few questions here. The first one, I believe, is from our president, SPJ New England president, who asks, what can groups like SPJ and our New England chapter, SPJ New England, do to continue to help?
Oh, well, I mean, I think having talks like this is a great help, right? Talking about the work that we do, you know, be a member, watch, participate, ask questions, get involved, you know, tell all your friends and relatives about the kind of work we do. And mostly, I think, care about journalism. I mean, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but independent journalism is under great threat, not just public media, all kinds of media. And so I think that fighting for the First Amendment and fighting for the press and fighting for platforms on which, you know, you are reporting facts and putting out true stories, that is the most important thing. And, you know, we're in there too, fighting with you every single day. But I think we've got to take very, very seriously the threats to an independent press in our country at this moment.
I second that to the fullest degree. And thank you, SPJ. I mean, I think the work you do is really, really important. And there's a lot of ground that we collectively have to cover, and it's not going to ease up anytime soon. So we appreciate the work you do, and we really appreciate this forum.
Thank you. We're very happy to be of service, especially for events like this. We have another question here from Dan Kennedy, who asks, are there ways that GBH and BUR might collaborate in order to maintain your journalism while saving money? And he specifies, I am not asking if the two stations would merge, which I know you are sometimes asked about.
Yeah, we get asked that often. I mean, the funny thing is that I probably talk to Susan as much as I talk to any public radio colleagues in the world, and we collaborate often. I mean, just today, we're part of a group of the major market stations across public media, and among the things that we're thinking very, very thoughtfully and strategically together about things that we can do to both elevate our work and share work across not just GBH and BUR, but across the country. So, for example, what are the ways that we can think about technology support of one another so that not everybody is doing the same thing over and over again and spending their own dollars on the same thing. But there are a million ways that we're all contemplating how to work well together.
You know, the other thing is, you know, I don't know if people know, but Margaret and I are both part of a New England News Cooperative group that is a conglomeration of stations across New England telling stories. And you hear these stories on both of our air, right? So it's a big collection of us. I don't know, is it about 6, 7 of us, Margaret? I'm not sure.
You have to say the names out loud. It's Maine, it's Connecticut, it's New Hampshire, it's Boston, and Vermont.
Okay, 8. So there's 8 of us all in this collaboration, and, you know, talking about what stories that we should tell and content that we can exchange that is of interest, not just in our own local markets, but across the entire region, and what stories we should tell, right? Should we go out and report collectively on? So those are the kinds of things that I think we can do, and we can do much, much more of it. And, you know, maybe at some point we should talk about, you know, other things that we can do at the back end of the business too, right? Like Margaret mentioned, you know, technology collaborations, purchasing agreements. I don't know what, but there are a bunch of things where I think that there's fruitful conversation to be had.
Excellent. I think we may have kind of already touched on Bruce Kellerman's question here, which is whether GBH and BUR have considered combining news or back office operations, unless you had anything else to add on that note.
The only thing to say about back office, which I think is important that for people to know, is we are licensed to Boston University. And so our entire back office is supported by Boston University. And so back office is sort of not, it's not really an issue for us. I mean, and it's we have a wonderful relationship with the university, and anybody who's worked here knows that it's been, I mean, there are complexities to having a lean news organization as part of a giant university, but there are also great advantages too.
Got it. We have one more question. Hello, recent college graduate here. Do you think student newsrooms might be a viable path toward remedying news deserts / sealing gaps in the local media landscape? Great question.
Yes. In fact, a little plug for our friends at Boston University. So Brian McGrory, who used to be the editor of the Boston Globe, is now runs the journalism department, which is part of the School of Communications at BU. And in January, and they're going to do it again this fall, they launched BU student newsroom literally right outside my office. And there were about 20 or 25 students who reported for both BUR and newsrooms across the state of Massachusetts, and many of them in news deserts. And it was, I mean, it's actually, BU isn't the first university to do this, but there's a whole movement afoot where student journalists are indeed filling the gap for news organizations that don't have the resources to hire as many reporters as they need. And the other thing I'll say to the recent graduate, I don't know who it is. What's heartening to me, and I'm sure Susan sees this too, is as hard a business as this is, and we all know how hard it can be or how hard it can feel, there are still so many young people who really, really want to be journalists, right? That just hasn't waned at all. And any job we open or any fellowship we open, we get just piles and piles of people raising their hands and saying, we want to do it. And so it's affirming to me that it's like art, right? The world, people need to do it, they need to make it, and the world needs it. And despite the complexity of the moment, that hasn't waned. And it's very affirming.
Oh, I agree. You know, as somebody whose career started as the intern who got hired, I think that the role that students can play is incredibly important, and not just in learning from the veterans in different places. You know, at GBH, we have about 100 interns a year coming through our doors. And what I've always liked about the modern workplace is that it used to be just like the old people telling the young people what to do. Now, given especially changes in technology and the need to reach a whole nother generation of folks who are wanting their information in different ways, I'm often amused to watch the young people telling the old people what to do. So I think there's a huge opportunity for young people, particularly who are interested in journalism, to really help everybody understand, how do we reach that next generation of audience? Because that's where we've got to get to, because we can't just, we can't just be a bunch of middle-aged people talking to each other. So please, I am so happy, recent graduate, that you are interested in this and doing this, and help us all understand how to reach folks now.
Definitely. And congratulations to this recent graduate. And I can also offer my 2 cents, which is that I also have a journalism degree from Boston University. I'm a proud alum. And yes, we were very familiar with the work that GBH and WBUR were doing as we were kind of in the classrooms and out on the streets. So a great nostalgic note to end off on there. And with that, I thank you both so much for taking the time with us, sharing some insights tonight. And to everyone who joined, thank you again for your support, your attention. And I hope everyone has a lovely rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stella. Thanks, everyone. You did a wonderful job, Stella. Thank you.
Thank you.